Dorset Great Lakes Museum, I don't think I pronounced that correctly, and 250,000 artifacts of the City of Detroit's collection. He's also a board member of the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History, and he is the author of a number of books and magazine articles. His latest book is Floating Palaces of the Great Lakes, a history of passenger steamships on the inland seas. And he is also a very interesting speaker. Please give a warm welcome to Joel Stone.
Thank you. I will let them decide if I'm a very interesting speaker, but I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Before I get started here, we had something really cool happen at our organization this week. We launched a bunch of films. We've been digitizing photographs. You go to our website and you can access 40,000 photographs, ship plans, documents, all kinds of stuff related to Detroit history, which has been great. That's been the last 2 years. For the last year and a half, we've been documenting film and videotape. We got a call about 2 years ago from the City of Detroit's Public Relations Department saying, we've got 5,000 videotapes. You want them? Yeah, okay, so we said yes. And they said, okay, two things, you gotta bring 2 trucks, and you gotta come in the next hour or 2. So we dropped everything. We got over there. We're in the process of doing that. Because we finally got it up on our website, it's been about a year, we got it up on the website, you can access them now. One of the guys who's been working on it put together a quick trailer, so this is going to only last a couple of minutes, but it's kind of fun, and it kind of addresses that historic preservation thing we were talking about, and I will try to address the sound here as we go forward. Doesn't start immediately.
Because you gotta say something good about the city, and we're gonna do it in this song. This is my home. I like to be with my friends. They like to be with me, beside me, feeling real good in my neighborhood. It's my home. You see, this is Detroit.
25 minutes of Dennis Archer dancing.
People who share, it's got a heart, story to tell. It's my home, you see. Whoa, Detroit, Detroit, my home. Detroit, Detroit, my home. Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is Detroit. I'm proud to live in this town. I've got some neighbors who care, people who share. It's got a part, it's sure enough got a heart. It's my home, you see. Whoa, Detroit, 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 my home. It's my home. Detroit, Detroit, my home. I'm talking about the place we love. Detroit, Detroit, my home. Detroit, Detroit, my home. Oh yeah, come on, let's say it one more time. Detroit. Detroit, my home.
Right there's why we need historic preservation. Gorgeous building, the old federal building, long gone. Thanks for putting up with that. I should have downloaded it to the laptop instead of trying to play it off the thumb. So, anyway, onward and upward here. So 20 famous Detroiters. This was a blast to put together because there have been so many. I had to kind of narrow it down to just 20. But before I get into that, of course, I have to give you a quick, if you like Detroit history, if you enjoy what we do, we run 2 museums, the Detroit Historical Museum on Woodward right across from the DIA, and Dawson Great Lakes Museum, which is over on Belle Isle. And it's real easy to find us, detroithistorical.org. I was going to bring a bunch of brochures, but they come out tomorrow. So I did bring a couple of things that have our website on it. If you'd like to go there and see it, that'd be great. But this was kind of fun. Figuring out, I mean, famous people. There are lots and lots of famous people through the time that we've been here, 300 plus years. How do we figure out? There's a category of people that were famous when they were alive. Hugely famous, either in the city, state, nationally. Some of these guys internationally famous when they were alive. And today, if you mention them to somebody, nobody's heard of them. Absolutely gone. They just have disappeared from our historic landscape. And it's really kind of too bad because these were influential people. These are the people who kind of drove what was going on in the city for many, many years. And I said 20. And 1 or 2 of you, it's a historical society. Some of you guys are going to have heard of some of these, right? So I've tossed in about 6 extras. So I hope we get you up to 20. And I'm also going to be reading from a script only to keep me on time so we get out of here early, because some of these I can talk about for a long time. Starting at the very beginning, going back, I mean, we start with Native Americans. They've been in the Detroit area for at least 1,000 years, and I'm guessing more than that. Actually famous though, probably Chief Little Turtle. He was a leader of the Miami Band, which really kind of was located down in the area we call Toledo now, around the Miami River, Maumee River. And then a little later they had shifted over to the west side of the state in the area, Berrien County, in that neighborhood there. And the Miamis were a warring tribe, like many of them. They had to keep up with everybody. And they did very well keeping the Americans out. They were allied with the British. After the Revolutionary War was over, of course, we won. The British said, well, we're not sure that this little American experiment's going to last, so why don't we just stick around? So they stayed in Detroit. And the Americans really, for a couple of years, couldn't afford to send anybody to drive them out. And when they could, they sent 2 disastrous expeditions that came out under General Harmer, and then General St. Clair, both of which were a mess. They finally sent out Mad Anthony Wayne. He finally beat all of basically the Native Americans who were there at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, and after that, 2 years later, then the Americans were able to take over Detroit. Little Turtle, though, Mission Kinniqua, which is his name, he had been one of the leaders with Blue Jacket. He had been one of the leaders with the British against the Americans. When he realized the British really weren't allied with them and weren't going to stick around and help, he was one of the guys that tried to get the Miami tribe to kind of acquiesce to the Americans. And it wasn't until after the Battle of Fallen Timbers that it really happened. There's a painting here of Wayne at the Treaty of Greenville with the first of the major Native American treaties in 1795. And because of his activities in trying to get his people to work with the Americans, and the Americans weren't easy to work with, so he wasn't entirely successful, but he did get some celebrity status. Once the Americans had acquiesced to the Indians had acquiesced to the Americans, he toured the East. He met George Washington. He was very highly respected by the people in Detroit as far as his influence in the Native American community, and we named a street after his tribe, Miami Street. This is Woodward's modified plan. This is the second of 3 plans that Woodward tried to get with his spoke-shaped plan. And Miami Street is here. Part of the street is still here. The upper part is still here. It's called Broadway today. We kind of changed the name, but because of the Miami tribe and because of Blue Jacket and his fame, the only Native American tribe represented in the first plan. Sticking kind of early, there's Benjamin Woodworth, and Benjamin Woodworth is one of my favorites because I did a lot of study on taverns in early Detroit. Hey, you got to start somewhere, right? I understood taverns. Taverns were an important thing in Detroit. It was where people gathered. It's where the courts were held. It's where time was kept. It was where money was changed. It was where news was gathered and exchanged when people came in either by canoe or by sailboat or eventually by steamboat, as we see here. It's where people gathered to do things. It was where weddings were held. After the War of 1812, in 1815, we had a big pacification ball. Americans and Canadians got together and put the war behind them at Ben Woodworth's Tavern. And it was located right here. First three-story building we had in town. It was the most celebrated hostelry west of Buffalo. And that was saying something, because there were some pretty wild places out there. We did have a couple of other taverns where people could stay. There was one other hotel. The Mansion House was slightly downriver. But if you were coming to town of modest or upper modest means, you probably stayed at Woodworth's Hotel. He had served half the people in town and had a good time. He named it after his first hotel burned down. He realized with the coming of the steamboat, he needed to get a bigger hostelry. He built this one, called it Woodworth's Steamboat Hotel, and so it remained. Unfortunately, his son, Woodworth bought a steamboat himself to work as a ferry between Detroit and Sandwich, and his son was on board when it exploded, and his son was one of the first steamboat casualties on the Great Lakes. But Ben was the guy. He owned the livery stable. He owned the only coach in town. In fact, there's a picture of it that goes back to Farmer about 150 years ago. He only coach in town. They waited until the steamboat came in. He traded horses. He was a banker. He was a captain in the militia and a great host by everybody's comments. He also was the hangman for the very last hanging in Michigan. Right before we became, there was a guy who had gotten, I guess he had gotten inebriated. He killed his wife. He was very repentant. The hangman who was hired would not hang him because of his repentance. And Ben said, if we're going to have law, we got to have law. So he stepped up. And the most popular guy in town was also the hangman. These two folks are some of my favorites. Walter Harper. Harper Avenue is named after him. Harper Hospital is named after him. And Anne, or Anna Nancy Martin, her name was Anne. People called her Anne, but most people called her Nancy. Or as the Beatles would say, everyone knew her as Nancy. Walter Harper was a character. He was a grocer, got into the real estate business and started buying real estate in Detroit, especially up in Greenfield Township, which is up slightly to the north and the west of Woodward and the New Center area. And invested heavily, and had a wife, brought her to Detroit. He lived in Philadelphia. Brought her to Detroit. She died. He went back to Philadelphia, got a housekeeper. He had 3 kids, so he got a housekeeper. She was Ann Martin. She was twice widowed. Both husbands had been sailors. She lost a daughter in infancy. She was kind of a broken woman, tough woman. And Harper hired her to take care of his kids. And then he married another woman, and they all moved back to Detroit. Within a year, the second wife was dead. Walter and Ann lived together for the rest of their lives. For a long time, she was listed in the directories as his housekeeper. About halfway through their life, he was started to be listed as her boarder. Yeah, you see where this is going, all right? Now, I've got nothing to base this on other than what I'm telling you. He looks like a pretty dour guy, and I think he was. The children by his first marriage completely disowned him. He became much of a hermit. Dedicated himself to making money, and finally was approached by the folks who the Presbyterian Church wanted to start a hospital. There's only one hospital in Detroit. It's a Catholic hospital. They wanted to build another one, and they got him to donate all of his property to fund the hospital. But the land for the hospital came from her, and she was about the opposite of what he was. Whereas he was quiet, she was gregarious. Big, Irish woman. had gotten into the greengrocer business and eventually made enough that she bought or rented a stall in the city market and got into selling high-end fowl, quails and ducks and that kind of thing. And the people who bought from her really got to know her very well. She got to know the elite in Detroit, enjoyed playing euchre with them in her, heavy boots and her big, hat and stuff. This was what she would have looked like when she went to the city market. Most of the record for her is in the police files. She was arrested many times for drunkenness. She had what did they say? A very Saxon vocabulary. Take that for what you will. But she did very well by that stall, to the point where she was one of the greater benefactors of her church. Would dress up every Sunday, even having been out Saturday night. She'd get into her widow black and go to church on Sunday, and she would be there. And made enough money that when he was donating his property to run the hospital, she donated her property for the hospital. With the one caveat that they built him a little cottage on the hospital grounds, which they did. They lived together there until he died about 6 years later. She couldn't stay in the cottage after that, and she moved into the hospital. And that's where the other record are the stories of her coming out of her apartment, talking with the doctors and the nurses in her Saxon vocabulary. And she was a character, and one of those people that really have kind of fallen off the map. Harper got the hospital and the street named after him. Martin Place was the street that led out of the front of the hospital and would have run right into Orchestra Hall today. Right now there's a electrical contractor's 10-story building where Martin Place is. So unfortunately, Ann Martin has really fallen off the radar. This individual will be henceforth regarded as Detroit as one of the most magnificent benefactors of his species known in the annals of American philanthropy. You ever heard of him?
No.
Yeah, okay. Here is Martin Place, right out in front of the hospital coming out there. There's the city market where she had her stall. She was remembered as, though devoid of culture, she had a very decided character that with proper cultivation would have made her in any sphere a remarkable and a noted woman. So after she died, people respected her. Here's a guy completely fallen off the map, Philetus. Philetus came here and had been investing. Let me switch pages here. Had come here as a trapper. He had been in the Civil War. He came here slightly afterwards and got into real estate promotion, and eventually started a town. And I don't know if anybody's heard of it. Norris. You ever heard of the town of Norris? Right in the middle of Detroit, just to the south and east of where Hamtramck sits today. And it's one of many. There were lots of towns that Smithville kind of got swallowed up. There's Philetus Norris. Philetus went on eventually to become the superintendent of Yellowstone. In fact, there's 3 peaks, a pass, and a geyser basin that are named after him. Okay, so he did fairly well, but while he was here, he started his own town. Here's the town of Norris from the 1876 atlas, and you can see that there's a railroad running right up through the middle of it here. There's the depot grounds here. He actually started a tavern and a post office. It's still there. It's called the Two-Way Inn. If you've ever been near downtown Detroit, it is the oldest tavern in the city. I don't care what anybody else says. This is the one that's got it. And just to kind of give you some orientation, there it is with the railroad running up the center, Norris Trunk Road. Off to one side would be Mound, off to this side would be Centerline. Centerline Road had nothing to do with the city. Centerline was the middle of the township. Just to put it in perspective, kind of over near where Dodge Main is, City Airport, you can see in the purple. Let me see if I hit that. Right there, there's City Airport. So you can see where Norrisville used to be. And in fact, most of it's still there. Most of it still resides on the line right at Nevada. Basically Nevada and Mound, you're going to be there. So, completely forgotten. Nobody remembers him except in Yellowstone. In Detroit, he's gone. Captain Francis Martin wasn't born here. Had an interesting career. He got involved with what they called the Revenue Cutter Marine. This was our early version of Border Patrol. Okay, these guys ran this. He had been involved with it all over the world. In fact, he was over in the Mediterranean when they buried Napoleon. There's a picture of Napoleon's funeral. He had been there and was able to witness that. He was a friend with John James Audubon. Got involved in that, and then he got involved with the Revenue Marine. He was part of the some of the secession things that were going on during the Jackson administration. Eventually got kind of a cozy job running the boat we just saw here, the Fessenden, out of Detroit. He was the captain, finally retired in his 80s. And this is from our Century Box. We've got the Century Box that they planted in 1901 and we opened in 2001. And it's his signature there, Francis Martin, listed as the oldest man in the city. He lived to 100. He signed this, they buried the Century Box, and he died about 5 days later. So, completely unknown, but involved in a whole lot of stuff. These two guys, John Horn, George Horn, they were brothers. And they were famous for two very different reasons, and really unfortunate. They were both captain of ferries. Started out, they were both born in England. They came over here. Their father owned the pub right on the end of Woodward at the docks. So as you got off of the ferries, or if you got off any of the steamboats, you were going to go into their dad's pub. It was a good piece of property. And they got involved in a lot of the stuff on the waterfront. And John, and he would regret it later, but John learned to swim. And John was the guy everybody called when somebody fell in the water. Back then, nobody swam. So if you went in the water, your chances were you were dead, unless you had a guy like him. And he would be woken at any time of the day or night. They'd go up and knock on the pub door and get him up, and he'd come on, and he swore he ruined about $1,000 worth of clothes jumping into the water. He would go in and rescue 9, 10 people at a time. He would go in when the ice was just as we see it around his steamer. He did buy the steamer, got into the business of running the Excelsior across back and forth to Windsor, sometimes up and down to Belle Isle. And eventually the city gave him an award. He had saved 110 people. And so the city gave him a gold medal. And when he was in saving some poor girl, he lost the gold medal. I don't know why you'd have it in your pocket, but he did. They found out in Congress, and Congress actually struck a congressional gold medal for him and gave it to him. In fact, I think that's the next picture here. There's his gold medal that he won. Jumping into the ice water didn't do him very well. As he got older, it was tougher and tougher on him. And unfortunately, when he went in again to save somebody, while he was gone, somebody stole his medal. Okay? Tough life. The guy's a good guy. What are they're stealing his medal? Congress re-struck the medal. It's the only time a congressional medal has been struck twice. So, famous guy. That's the good side. The bad side was his brother George, who was involved in probably the greatest loss of life on the Detroit River ever. Yeah, it was really too bad. He had been the skipper of I believe it was the Garland, and he was downriver. He had gone down near Boblow, down in that area, and he was coming home. It was night. The other steamer that was running was behind him, following him. It was a beautiful moonlit night, though everybody who was there described it as visibility was pretty good. There was a group of, I guess it was the priest and the altar boys and some of the people who worked at Trinity Church downriver, the Irish church. And they had gotten on the Mamie, and the Mamie was a small yacht, steam yacht. And they had gone down river to Monroe. They had spent the day in Monroe, had a good time, had gone swimming, had a picnic. They were on their way home, and the boats crossed. Nobody knows what happened. The descriptions were all over the place. There was a lot of records, but of course they were contradictory. The Garland ran right over the Mamie. The priest, the housekeeper, were able to jump onto the Garland and save themselves. 6 other people were pulled out of the water, but 14 children and 4 of the adults died at that time. So while his brother's busy saving people, unfortunately this guy, not his fault, happened to be involved in kind of the greatest loss of life. And they both, unfortunately, were known for that. Charles van der Pol, those of you of Belgian heritage, any Belgians out there? There we go, all right. Came over from Belgium. He had started messing with electricity when he was a kid. He made his first light when he was in college, about in the 1870s. So he's playing around with this stuff at the same time Edison is. And Charles Van de Poel gets to Detroit and gets real involved with this. His profession is a carpenter. He makes church furniture for the most part. But he got so involved in electricity that he saw it as a way of, well, frankly, getting rid of horses and streetcars. Because one of the things horses do, as we know, is they kind of mess the street up. We had 21,000, almost 22,000 horses, 2,200 horses. So 2,195 horses working the streetcars in Detroit. 11 tons of manure each day, that's 8 million tons a year. So he thought it would be a really good idea if we didn't do the horse thing and we got into the electricity. He had a line running in Chicago fairly early, 83. In 86, he started the line in Windsor, Ontario. First guy to do that. And then he came up with this great idea of instead of having the electricity down below, you put this thing up here, which he called a trolley bar. So the guy who invented the word trolley was sitting here in Detroit, and he figured out a way to do that. And by the time, about 10 years later, there were 14 or 15 systems in different cities around the country, and 9 of those systems were his. So Van der Poel became the guy that put the lights in the Opera House, eventually moved to Chicago, but when he was here, he was very well known for being the guy that got the horses off the street. That'll make you real popular. Oops. Here are a couple of guys that I had never heard of. William Ferguson and David Augustus Starker. Here they are right here. William Ferguson is the son of the first African-American doctor in Detroit. Very well-read man. He was Michigan's first black legislator. We're talking back in the 1880s. Okay, so that's when this is going on. William Ferguson walked into the hotel of Mr. Guy's. Mr. Guy's ran the International Hotel, and German, he was a brewer. He owned 3 or 4 saloons around town, and this was really his landmark. And Mr. Ferguson wanted to have dinner, and he walked in, and he walked into a dining room, and there was the dining room, and then there was the bar. At least in his mind, that's what it was. The dining room had tablecloths, silverware, proper glass. He'd been well educated. That's where he wanted to have dinner. He sat down, and the waiter came over and said, "I can't serve you here. If you sit at this table right over here, I can serve you," which was just 6 or 8 feet away, but it didn't have any tablecloths. It had beer glasses, you know, old-fashioned type beer glasses. And Ferguson said, "No, I want to sit here and I want to have a nice dinner." And the boss came out, Mr. Guy's came out, and he said, "I'm really sorry. I would be happy to serve you, but I can't serve coloreds in this section. You're welcome to sit over here." And Mr. Ferguson said, "That's not good enough." And so he left, and he went and found David Straker. And David Straker had been born in the Barbados. He had learned the law in Barbados and then moved up to South Carolina. Because he came from Barbados and had been part of a family that spoke with an Irish accent, he was known as the Black Irish Lawyer, because he spoke almost perfect English, except with that Irish thing thrown in, which frankly I like better than Liverpool. I hope nobody's from Liverpool here. But he came to South Carolina and learned the business well. He even ran for the legislature, just barely lost down in South Carolina in the 1880s. This is a guy who's got some gumption, okay, and not a dumb guy, smart guy. So Ferguson finds him, goes to him, and they go to the Michigan Supreme Court with this case. It goes up through the levels of all the courts, and eventually the Supreme Court gets it, and they find in his favor. Based on the laws of the day, guys could not do what he was doing. So it was the very first beginnings of a civil rights moment. Straker happened to be a friend of Frederick Douglass, Booker Washington, and especially W.E.B. Du Bois. So very well-respected man. This next one, John Clark and Alvin Clark, father and son. And I don't know, how many grew up in Detroit? I mean, let's start with Southeast Michigan. Southeast Michigan. Most of us? Half, okay. Actually understand the city of Detroit. We've been down there. Clark Street. All right, GM had big plants there. Clark Street, John Clark. He had a dry dock at the foot of Clark Street. He made ships, but he was basically in the fishing business. And his idea was to catch the fish here. He actually had holding pens on Belle Isle and down at Grassy Island, where they catch the fish, they put them in the holding pen, and when the price was good, he'd salt them up and he'd put them on his own ships. He owned the ships, built the schooners, and sent them off east. Believe it or not, he would send them east with fish and bring them back with salt. We didn't understand how much salt was under the city at that point. So that was basically his business, and building ships, and he did. And one of them he named after his son, Alvin. And Alvin went on to a wonderful career. He had a mineral baths, kind of familiar with same type of thing they had in Mount Clemens, but it was downriver there by Fort Wayne. And Alvin Clark did very well for himself, but that's not why he's famous. Okay, he's famous because the ship that was named after him ended up sinking. It was a beautiful day. They were coming back from Chicago in 1864. You can see the gray dark clouds there, came in with a quick squall, blew the boat over. They were drying out the holds, so all the holds were open. Boat filled with water, sank in a matter of seconds. Okay, 3 guys died, 2 survived. And it was 105 years later that some fishermen lost a brand new net. Brand new net. They just spent $1,000, $1,500 on this net. And so they went and got their buddy, who happened to be the owner of the local bar, who was a diver, to go out and find the net. And the guy went down to find the net, and he did. He found it attached to the Alvin Clark. He rallied people for 8 states around. Everybody in the Great Lakes, if you were a diver, you were involved in this project. It took him a little bit of about a year to kind of suss out the situation and get the equipment together. They went down, pumped out tons and tons of silt, raised the boat with the help of the folks at Marinette Marine. And when they got it up, they actually just threw some pumps into it, pumped it out, and it floated. It was in perfect shape. Best and oldest commercial sailing vessel floating in the world. Okay, these guys had done it, and this is a bunch of bar buddies. Okay, it was great. They had done it, and they'd made history. Howard Chappell from the Smithsonian called it the greatest thing. You know, the heck with all those wonderful treasure ships that they found. This is the finest treasure ship ever found, which was great for about 5 minutes. Okay, this was back in the 60s. We hadn't yet passed any of the underwater preservation laws. We hadn't passed any of the historic preservation laws that we're talking about now. He couldn't get money out of the state of Michigan. He couldn't get money out of the state of Wisconsin. He couldn't get money out of the feds. He talked about moving it around to different cities, any place he could go to get money, and it all dried up. He was able to have a museum for about 10 years, and then it started to do this. I don't know if anybody's into historic preservation, but if you have wood that's been underwater and you bring it up and you let it dry out, it's going to turn into dust. And that's exactly what the boat did. Within about 15 years, it was dust. They bulldozed it. They put it in a landfill. So within a very short time, the greatest ship to ever come up out of fresh water, and arguably out of any water, was gone. It prompted what we do today as far as historic preservation. If you find something on the bottom, you leave it on the bottom. Best place for it. All the laws changed. All of the divers, for years, divers, the reason to dive was to go out and find the cool stuff. You know, get the cool stuff, bring it up, put it on your mantle. That all changed. The divers even get it. They understand that if you want to leave it down there and tell a story with that wonderful time capsule that especially was the Alvin Clark. Died in a second. The food was still on the plates. And fortunately, we've still got some of those plates. We've got a lot of stuff off the Clark. And that's a whole other story. But anyway, if you want to save this kind of stuff, you got to save it now. You can't wait. You can't bring it up. You can't dink with it. And that's why Alvin Clark is famous. Michael D. and William Ferguson. This is the second William Ferguson in this presentation, I will note. Okay? Michael D. was the editor of the Detroit News. Worked for his father-in-law, William Scripps. William Ferguson was a guy who was a horticulturist, grew flowers like that. They came into a situation where Belle Isle was A, getting turned into it. You can see these bridges here on Belle Isle? These are railroad yards. They wanted to put a tunnel under the river. This one didn't work, so they decided to do it over here. And the city wanted to buy Belle Isle and turn it into a rail yard. They were also going to put a pest house on there, which meant a place for keeping people while they were in, what do they call it, quarantine, and an insane asylum. That was part of the plan. Okay, so that plan went away, which was a good thing. And they brought in Frederick Olmsted to come up with an idea to create a good park. Okay, Fred Olmsted came in, had nothing but trouble with the city. He did commission a plan. This is in our collection. He commissioned a plan from the city cartographer. This is the island as it was. Some lagoons down here, a few of the roads that went with the farms. I'm sorry, I'm really screwing up the guy who's filming, aren't I? But you can see the lagoons that are here. And Olmsted looked at that and he came up with his own plan. And the first thing he did was he filled in all the lagoons. Those of us who love Belle Isle love the lagoons as a big part of that. This is the plan he came up with. He ended up getting frustrated with the city. He knew they weren't going to follow this plan. Part of what he said was, don't put things like racetracks, museums, horticultural buildings, aquariums, zoos. Don't put zoos there, all right? They can go someplace else. That was his plan. He wanted to keep it cheap so the city could afford it. He knew that wasn't going to happen. He left, he went to Chicago and helped build the World's Fair there and had a great time. But we've used his name ever since on the island. And really the only parts that exist that he designed are kind of this loop canal. You're going to see the loop canal if you go down there, and you're going to see Central Boulevard. Central Avenue is still there. And he suggested that the athletic fields, you know, he called it a parade ground, but basically the athletic fields are there. So everybody says, all right, so who did the lagoons? Who actually did this design for Belle Isle? And it's William Ferguson. Okay, Ferguson and Dee together kind of came up with the idea of building in, keeping these lagoons, deepening them so that they weren't mosquito breeding grounds, and making that work. They came up with this. They kind of kept a little bit of the Olmsted-ness, but you can see they've also added very quickly. They've added, you'll pardon me for this being upside down, I just like making the transition work, you know, that way so you can see it. The boathouse, the casino, we've got picnic grounds, we've got all kinds of, you know, bandstands and things like that that are all here. This is actually still here. If you go down there, it's called the 1890s, what do you call this? Pavilion. So we'd already started building stuff by the time he left. But William Ferguson's the guy responsible for the lagoons. In fact, they're digging them out. They were all dug by hand. And when he died, they said basically he's the guy that put in the plan of the park, turned the mosquito breeding swamps into lakes, ran fine drives through what had been wilderness, and established all the flower beds. In short, he changed Belle Isle from a wilderness to a place of blossoming beauty. And I always like to bring up Ferguson's name along with Olmsted's. Olmsted was there, but Ferguson was the guy on the ground. Ferguson was the guy who got his fingers dirty, and Ferguson really, to me, is the guy that really laid out Belle Isle. William Livingstone, if you've been to Belle Isle, you've probably seen the Livingstone Lighthouse. It's way down at the far eastern end. It's the only marble lighthouse in the world, well, I'm sorry, in North America. It was designed by Albert Kahn, gave us some stuff there, but Livingstone owned a couple of shipping lines, and because he did that, he became the president of the Lake Carriers Association, which is the group that kind of made sure that the federal government spent money on dredging and straightening out waterways. The Livingston Channel down at the bottom of the Detroit River is named for him, but he also was a real busy guy. He was the founder and the first president of the Dime Bank Building. You can see the Dime Bank Building right here in this picture. Am I pushing the right button? No, there we go. This one here is the Dime Bank Building. Still down there. They've renamed it. I think it's Chrysler House or something. But he was behind that building. He was behind a couple of other businesses, including the one that took all the postcards. Detroit Photographic Company, very important institution in Detroit. They sent photographers around the world to take pictures because this is the time when people were starting to travel and they wanted to have a postcard to send home saying, you know, wish you were here. And he tapped into that market, and he did. He sent people to Egypt, he sent people to China, the Great Wall, to get all these pictures, but more importantly, he did it around the Midwest, around the places people were traveling. And if you go into the Library of Congress, the Detroit Photographic Company collection is probably the greatest single collection of American photographs between 1890 and 1910. And they're all there, they're all available for free, you can see them. The whole thing got turned over to the Library of Congress. His sons ran it for a while and eventually put it out of business. But he was a pretty influential guy. In fact, here he is with Howard Taft, and a guy, I don't know who the guy on the right is, I'm not sure who it is. But Clarence Burton said he's honored and respected by all. No man occupies a more enviable position than the financial and business circles in Detroit. And that's when he's sitting next to Henry Ford. Okay? But ask people on the street who William Livingstone is, probably won't get an answer. Cameron Waterman, for all you sportsmen, Cameron Waterman came from a fairly well-to-do family. He had toured the lakes. He was on the Yale rowing team and got sick and tired of rowing. They had a place up north. He wanted to go fishing. He had to row. They had a place on Grosse Ile. He wanted to go fishing. He had to row. He owned a motorcycle, a very early one with a Curtis engine on it. And when he was in his dorm room at Yale, he said, you know what? I bet I can make this thing do something. And so he took the engine out of the motorcycle, put it on a mechanism that he wasn't quite as sophisticated as this, but he made an outboard motor. And then he got a couple of friends to help him, and they actually made a working outboard motor. The first one had a chain drive, which kept getting caught in the ice. So then they went with something more geared. And he eventually became the first guy to market outboard motors. He sold 3,000 outboard motors before Ole Evinrude got started. That was just the next year. Okay, Ole came right behind him, but Cameron Waterman basically got the first commercially successful outboard motor in the United States and arguably in the world. And he got help from this guy. And this is a guy who you might have heard of, Oliver Bartel. He was we heard of horse whisperers. He was the gasoline engine whisperer, okay? He could make a gasoline engine work and knew how, when they were going from 1 cylinder to 2 or 2 to 4, how that was all going to work. You've seen him before. You have. He's kind of here. Burton says he's the man who made possible the success of many of the leading motor car companies in the country. And he did because of that. Here is a picture of him with Charles Brady King. This is the first, it wasn't Henry Ford, this is the first car to drive down the streets of Detroit. About 2 years before Ford really got his out. Charles Brady King was an engineer, he was a mechanic, he worked in the Lauer shop, which is a machinist shop. Mostly worked for the ships, but he also got into shipbuilding. Charles Brady King did. Made some yachts that he actually sold on the East Coast, put the engines in them. He was the guy that gave Henry Ford the pieces of his first engine. All right, Brady King was done with them. He gave Ford his leftovers and went on to start a car company and go from there. Bartel was the guy riding with him on that first trip. Okay, so then there's Henry Ford. And Henry Ford is getting into the business himself with that engine. And who's the guy keeping the engine going but Oliver Bartel? Who's the guy Cameron Waterman came to when he wanted to make his outboard motor work? That was Oliver Bartel. He's a guy who got into all kinds of things and was kind of behind the scenes and all. He worked with Olds, he worked with Buick. All these guys knew who he was. And he did very well for himself. He wasn't always behind the scenes or poor. He also worked in the marine engine business with the Scripps Company, the Waterman Company, and he put the engine into Detroit. And here's another story that we've all forgotten. I could go into this. The Scripps Company wanted to prove that gasoline engines were better than anything else out there. And so they put one of Bartel's engines into this, basically a lifeboat, and they sailed it from Detroit to St. Petersburg, 1912, I think it was. And these guys were nuts. It was the engine was a 4-stroke. They had to stop it every 12 hours to retune it. Had no muffler, so it was just, can you imagine being in a boat this size with an engine without a muffler? By the time they got to Cork, Ireland, where they stopped first, they were ready to kill each other. But an interesting story. They did make it to St. Petersburg. They proved that a gasoline engine could be as reliable as a steam or a naphtha or anything else out there. Jerome Remick, one of my favorites, I could go into this for a long time. He bought a company from a guy named C.J. Whitney and developed sheet music as an important marketing tool. The Remick band shell down in Belle Isle is named for him, but the company was global. The guy, he had the biggest sheet music business in the United States until Irving Berlin kind of took over in the 1930s. Okay, and Remick was based in Detroit. It had an office in New York. George Gershwin, Harry Warren worked for him. I grew up in a barbershop family. I could sing all of those songs. These were the Who and the Rolling Stones and the Beatles of the 1890s, okay? And as I tell kids when we talk about sheet music, because very few of them, unless they play an instrument, they don't know what sheet music was, okay? We've all got a phone in our pocket, right? If we want to make it work, you put an app on it. Back then, no radio, no phonographs, no television. You wanted music, you had to play it yourself. You had a piano, you had a guitar, you had a horn, but if you wanted to make the horn work, you had to have the sheet music. So this was the app for any musician in town, and he had the biggest business, and it was based right out of Detroit, and nobody knows who he is. Fred Stone also, this was my father's name, but this wasn't my father. Fred Stone was a guy born in Canada and then came over to the United States because Detroit had a really active music scene. And in fact, African Americans were very important in that music scene. They kind of established the Musicians Union in Detroit early on, 1890s, 1900s. And I won't claim that ragtime music was invented here, because there's people from New Orleans and Memphis and Kansas City and Chicago that would come after me. But I will say that this is the very first piece of music that had the word ragtime in the title, and My Ragtime Baby was the 8th ragtime tune ever recorded. So we were really close to being in on the ground floor. Harry P. Guy was the guy that worked with Fred Stone. They really were the kind of the leaders of the band set during the 1890s, 1910, when that music was so popular. Thomas E. Clark, electrical guy. He was about a half a step behind Marconi. When Marconi was inventing radios, Thomas Clark was doing the same darn thing. When Marconi was over in Europe, Thomas Clark was here. Marconi came to the United States and got the patents just a step ahead of Thomas Clark. And Thomas Clark was kind of left fighting patent battles for much of his life. But he also started his own company as a young guy. He got into wireless, and remember, wireless back then meant telegraph. It was pretty important if you could send, the dit and dot telegraph message over the airwaves instead of over the wires. This is real important, especially to shipping. And this is a wonderful photo that I found when I was doing some research. It is the Pleasure, one of the Detroit-Windsor ferries, going down to get the Greyhound. The boats were built down in Wyandotte, and then they were towed up with the hull without the machinery, or some of the machinery, and they were towed up to the Orleans Street dock of the Detroit dry docks. And that's where all the cabins and stuff went on. That's where all the joinery work was done. And this is the very first time on the Great Lakes, and one of the earlier times in the country, that the trip down to Wyandotte and the trip back was being telegraphed the whole time. What the water conditions were like, what idiots were standing in front of the boat. All of this was being done by telegraph. And this is Thomas Clark doing this. He was also the first guy to send a voice-to-voice radio telephone message from a shoreline, which was up in Alpena, out to a vessel on the Great Lakes. He was also really involved in the very beginnings of WWJ, which there's a couple of other radio stations that would argue that this was the first commercial radio station. I would say it was the first commercial radio station that didn't have a license, okay? It started programming before they actually got the license. But Thomas Clark was involved in that. He later went on to develop a whole electronic business, selling radios, selling phonographs, selling all the things you need. And happily, when he got out of the business, he gave most of this to us. So I can go through that picture and point to all the stuff that we've got in our collection that he gave to us. So this is a lot of fun. He went on, but even more importantly, actually the company is somewhere in northwest, in southeast Michigan. I mean, so it's up, I think in Waterford maybe. When he was getting out of the electronics business, he had a dog, and the nails, he needed something to clip the nails. If you look up Tekla was Thomas E. Clark. Tekla was his company name. Tekla now makes those nice little things that you trim your cat and dog nails with. Okay? The company is still in business. They're still doing that. They still got the patent on it, and they're running with it. So kind of fun when that company's still around. John Hacker, everybody's heard of Chris Smith. Chris Kraft, okay? Hacker, well, all right, you beat me there. So you heard of Hacker. I'm glad of that. That's a good thing, because John Hacker was in there right at just about with Chris Smith. He was maybe a half a generation behind, but he understood the dynamics. He was a self-trained naval architect. He understood the dynamics of fast boats. He was involved in developing some of the very early race boats that took place on the Detroit River. And remember, the Detroit River, we're going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Gold Cup race in Detroit. Miss Detroit with Garwood won it in 1915, and then he brought it back to Detroit. So the first running of the Gold Cup on the Detroit River is in 1916. So that centenary is coming up. John Hacker started a company, actually built a bunch of boats, and they were darn pretty boats. He worked with the folks down at Gregory Marine. If you're up and down Jefferson, you'll see Gregory is still in business. John Hacker started his own company, put it in Mount Clemens. He was not a very good businessman, lost the company, and then went on to design for all kinds of other people. Some of the prettiest boats you'll ever see. The Thunderbird up on the top there is out on Lake Tahoe. In fact, both of these are on Lake Tahoe. But the Thunderbird, I mean, we're talking high Art Deco. This guy was an artist when it came to designing boats. That whole stainless steel cover, spectacular vessels. There is actually a company that is doing Hacker using his plans, but modern composites to make boats in his design. Still around. He did do a lot of faster boats later on. Here he is with the Dawson brothers up in the corner here with Miss Pepsi at the Detroit Yacht Club showing that off. And Miss Pepsi at the time turned the fastest laps when he was. Now, John's getting a little old there, so had a good long career, except for this guy, most people don't know. So. Eddie Stinson, another one of my favorites, not born here, born in Alabama, but came up here, got into the aeronautics business very early on. His sister, Catherine, right here, taught him to fly. She got into it, loved it, first woman to carry U.S. airmail. There's some great video on the web of her and her airplanes. She was just a real phenom, but Eddie got into it, and Eddie became one of the leading test pilots. Of course, at that time, you needed test pilots. All of this stuff was very new. So he did that. He got backers. He started his own company. It was out in Wayne, Michigan, and started the Stinson Aeronautic Company. Stinson Detroiter was probably his most famous design. And here's a couple of the bonus guys right here. There's a Detroiter, the pride of Detroit, Stinson Detroiter. Edward Schley and William Brock were the 8th guys to fly across the Atlantic. And it was part of an around the world. Everybody was trying, once they cleared the Atlantic, they wanted to go around the world, and they almost did it. They got as far as Japan. The weathers were bad, the timing was bad, they were pretty sure they were going to die, so they called it off. And lived to tell about it. But that's the Stinson Company has a wonderful history in Detroit, Eddie Stinson being the kind of the lead guy on that whole thing. James Scripps Booth, this guy really is not on anybody's radar, but he should be. Part of the Scripps Booth family, the Cranbrook family. This car, we're actually having it restored right now. It's called the Biotigo, 1913. It's really a motorcycle, okay? These things, you've got a crank, and these little training wheels lift up here. You just pull the crank, and the training wheels go up, and you can drive that sucker maybe. Okay, it weighs about 3 tons, very heavy. That's about 480 feet of copper tubing for a radiator there. Kind of eclectic. It's the first first vehicle in Detroit to be built with a V8 engine. So it's a motorcycle with a V8 engine. It's also the first vehicle built with the hinges on the inside of the vehicle instead of sticking out the way they do on a Model T. So pretty ingenious, kinda. I think he only ran it himself twice. It really was too unwieldy. We sent it out to a museum, the Peterson out in California recently. They had an exhibit called "What Were They Thinking?" And the good part is, he gave us all of his drawings too, so we know what he was thinking. It was pretty crazy. He was out there. He was, because he had the money and everybody was getting into the car business at that time. 1915, there were 45 automobile manufacturers in Detroit, and another 70 companies that were supplying them. By 1915, Detroit was already the automotive capital of the world. Chicago had several car companies. Jackson had 2 car companies. I mean, there were lots of cities were doing it, but Detroit had 48. Okay, we were already there. So what he got into was what they called cycle cars. It was a rich man's toy. It was basically bicycle tires, very light, very large engines. They would go very fast. They were very expensive. It was a fad that lasted about 2 years, 1914 to 1916, and of those 48 companies, 25 of them were out of business. Okay, fads don't work very well. But he had fun doing that. This is another one of his cycles. This is a 3-person car. His uncle, William, kept saying, man, you got to make cars that people will buy. You can't make cars for rich people. And he really tried. This is a fancy car. I mean, it's a first car with a horn in the middle of the wheel, the steering wheel. So not a dumb guy. So he really did try to develop an automobile that other people could buy, but they were still way too expensive. His uncle fired him from his own company and hired this guy, William Stout. And Bill Stout's one of my favorites in Detroit history because he did so much, and I'm going to fly through it or I'm going to be way too long here. We mostly know him for the Trimotor, the Ford Trimotor, which, oddly enough, he didn't design, okay? It wasn't his. He got into automotive design fairly early. He was a kid from Minnesota who was actually a journalist for the first half of his life. And then he got into automotive or aeronautics. He built the first, in fact, I think I've got a picture. One of these slides got out of order here. This is the first metal, all metal, single-winged plane. Okay, this is I believe 1922. They're still building planes out of cloth and wood and wire. And he said, that's stupid. We got to make them so they last and they're much more aerodynamic. So he developed this for the Navy. He had Billy Stinson, who's flying it up here in the corner, or Eddie Stinson, fly it 5 times for the Navy. And then the Navy said, okay, we got to put our pilot in it. They put their pilot in it and the guy crashed it. So that was it. So then Bill Stout said, all right, I got to start a company. We got to make something of this. And he sent out 60 letters to all of the richest people in Detroit. And remember, Detroit is now rolling in capital. This car money is coming in. He sent out 60 letters saying, give me $1,000 and I promise you 2 things. You're going to have more fun than you ever had and you'll never see your money again. Okay? Sent those out and people got a hoot out of it. I mean, they corner him at the DAC and say, you know, you didn't send me a letter, but can I invest? Really? I mean, you're like the most honest guy I've ever heard pulling on my sleeve. So he ended up with about 110 investors in his company, and he really did go on to build a company that made planes. And they made some interesting stuff. This is a plane he made. Think of the Delta Wing flyers we've got today. This is a design that he came up with that he thought this would be really, really low windage so that we could get the most out of our engine and make the thing go as fast as possible. And he didn't just come up with the idea, he built the darn thing. And he flew the darn thing. Okay, and this caught people like Henry Ford's eye, and Henry Ford came to him and bought him out. Paid off all of his investors, so they actually did get their money back with a little bit of profit. And that's really when we started getting into the tri-motor. So that's when, this is Stout Airlines, because after Ford wrote him a very nice check, he had to do something with it. So Ford took over. This is Ford Field, by the way. I think this is the Dearborn Inn off in the distance, first airport hotel. So they're out there, and Stout goes into the airline business, and he does. He starts the first airline in the country with a regular scheduled service between towns. And he started pretty simply, Detroit to Cleveland, Detroit to Kalamazoo. Eventually, it got rolled into another company and eventually got rolled into United Airlines. So arguably, United Airlines started right here. Bill Stout, he got over that. He just kept moving. He had this idea that you could have a plane that was a car. So you could fly into an airport, screw off the wings, and drive off to your shopping, come back, put the things on, okay. But he made it, and he flew it, okay. He had fun, and that's not the prettiest thing, but this certainly would have been. And again, he's like Scripps Booth. When he left Detroit and moved to Arizona, he left us with most of his collection. And he was coming up with all kinds of things. The Batwing was one of them, but he also got into automotives. This car is actually on display at the museum right now. This is the Scarab, and it's because he was an aeronautic guy, it's got an exoskeleton, hence the name Scarab. So he built this exoskeleton, V8 engine in the back, Ford V8, built on a Model T platform. You can see that the strutting is huge. This car didn't turn like our cars turn. So when we go around a curve, you know, we kind of lean to the outside. When his car went around the curve, it went around the curve. He supposedly drove from Detroit to California with a glass of water on the dash and didn't lose a drop. Quite a character. I mean, it was arguably the first minivan. It had a big interior because the engine was in the back. It didn't have the, you know, the standard tunnel running up the middle here. Okay, so it was a minivan. You could get in, you could move the seats around. It had a table. Of course, I'm not sure that the OSHA would let us, or the Transportation Safety Board would let us get away with moving chairs around the way he did. But an interesting car, nonetheless. And also after World War II, he decided to do it again, only he made it with fiberglass. And it was the first all fiberglass integrated body, no steel body here, or steel frame. It's all fiberglass body, fiberglass frame. We also have this car. It's over in Hickory Corners at the museum there. So just an incredible guy. He got into trains. He built these for Pullman. You know, meant basically as a gas-driven train so that each unit could operate indispensably. And he also had an idea where we would get someplace, you'd roll up the railroad wheels, roll down bus wheels, and it would become a bus. So talk about thinking out of the box, huh? And then there's Stan and Iris Oshinsky. Really, Stan was kind of the lead here. He had a place down on Square Lake Road for many, many, many years. And I'm gonna go for my notes here because I don't want to do Stan wrong. He was involved in building stuff for energy sustainability. All of us got the phone in our pocket. The battery inside of it is probably because of Stan. He was involved, let's see, the environmentally friendly nickel metal hydride battery, flexible thin film solar panels, so he was very early into the solar panel business. LCD, if you got a TV, well, nobody's got LCD TVs anymore, do they? Or do they? Sorry. If you have a liquid crystal display television, Stan invented it. Rewritable CDs and DVDs. Hydrogen fuel cells, all of that stuff that's being used today. Non-volatile phase change memory, which I can't tell you what that means. 400 patents. Got into a bunch of things. He did partner with Texas Avonics. Avonics was actually the name of his company, and he dealt with that kind of thing. He was named, Stanford named him one of the heroes of the planet, along with Time Magazine in 1999. He was inducted into the U.S. Solar Energy Hall of Fame in 2005. And if you say Stan Oshinsky's name, I don't think anybody would know who he was. He died just a couple of years ago. I got to meet him right before he did, and this is a quote from a couple of his biographers. And by golly, that's about as close as I could get to describing meeting this guy. Smartest guy I've ever sat in a room with, absolutely. And he had a quiet little campus up on Square Lake Road, just east or just west of Adams. And he kept to himself. He invented stuff. He came up with these incredibly brilliant ideas. Never finished high school. Pretty much self-taught. One of those guys we all kind of wish we were when we wanted to quit high school. So So who's the next famous person that we've never heard of? Who today is right at the top of the list, and in 20 years, 100 years, nobody's going to know who they are? I'm keeping an eye open. If you think of somebody, send it to me. We'll add it in as time goes on. But that's this was a fun presentation. I think there's so many people like this. The two ladies who created Mariners Church. You know, Mariners Church right in the center of downtown Detroit, one of the finest and oldest of the Sailor Bethels, and it was two spinster ladies who had more money than they knew what to do with and left the money, and nobody knows their names. So there's lots of people like that. As you think about Detroit history, think in terms of that. Think of the terms of the people behind the scenes, the people who helped Henry Ford invent the assembly line, okay? There are just lots and lots of people out there who've been important to Detroit history, and the word doesn't get out. I really appreciate you having me out to give this presentation. It's one of my favorites, and I hope you learned something, and I'm happy to take questions.
Was Mr. Ferguson ever able to go back to that hotel and get his meals?
No. I never heard. I don't think he wanted to when it was all done.
Oh,
I think he had gotten his victory. At least it's not in the record. I've not heard that. But that's a good question.
well, I
You'd
could throw
think.
that trouble and then not go back.
And then not go back. That's right. I bet you he might have gone to a nicer place.
Yeah.
I don't know, the Pontchartrain Hotel. Yeah.
This goes back to very early in your presentation, but when you mentioned Ann Martin,
Yeah.
wasn't there a Martin Place Hospital over in that area up on the east?
I don't think so.
Martin Place Hospital was in the one.
Okay, but it was called Martin Place?
Oh, I
Okay.
wonder if they're related. I wonder if there's a relation with Harper Hospital. Is it still there?
I don't think it's called that
It's
anymore.
changed names.
Yeah.
I think it's a senior facility now.
Okay.
Okay.
It was around for.
I'll have to look. One of the things she did, because she had lost a child in childbirth, I'm sorry, when the kid was about 1.5 years, is she insisted that when the hospital opened, it have laying-in facilities so that women could come and have their babies and be kept properly, as opposed to the way she was. Well, thanks again for having me. I hope the snow's not too deep. Drive carefully.